In this video, we're going to take a quick look at the difference between brush opacity and brush flow. And those two settings are right up here in the top of your toolbar here panel. You can see the opacity and the flow setting. Both of mine are set at 100%. Now, I'm just going to grab a brush here. I'm going to stick with the same color we used in this last video tutorial. I'm going to decrease my size here and get sort of a hard brush so you can see this a little bit better. Now, I'm going to grab first my opacity setting, and I'm going to change opacity maybe down to 25%. And opacity you're probably aware with, it's just the opaqueness of the brush. So here I've got a brush now, if I sort of brush next to each other, that's 25% opaque. And where they overlap, that's 25% plus 25%. And if you keep painting overlapping lines, of course those opacities stack and it gets right darker and darker and darker. So that's sort of the way opacity works. Now I'm going to crank this back up to 100%, and I'm going to take flow now down to 25%. And you can see what's happening here with flow is that each overlapping brush is 25%. And where they stack, if you sort of paint in the same spot over and over and over and over and over, you're increasing the flow. And so each 25% eventually overlaps in the middle here. It's just going to be a solid opaque brush. Now, flow and opacity are actually affected by one another, and I'll demonstrate how that works. All right, I'm back to a blank slate here, so we can look at how this opacity and flow are sort of intertwined. Now, I'm going to start off here with 100% opacity and 100% flow, and I've got my airbrush mode enabled. Now, with airbrush mode enabled, this is sort of meant to simulate an airbrush where you have a nozzle with paint coming out and some air pressure. So if I just press and hold down in a single spot, you can see it's sort of like the ink or paint continually flows like you would with an airbrush. If I just do a single dot, it does a dot. If I stop and hold in a particular spot for a moment, it starts to build up the paint like an airbrush would. So with that setting enabled, I'm going to demonstrate this opacity versus flow. So we're going to start off with a little bit smaller brush here, but I'm just going to paint straight across here in a kind of a wavy line. And I have 100% flow and 100% opacity. So in other words, the pigment flow is sort of how fast the pigment comes out of the brush, if you will. So it's coming out pretty quick, so it goes to 100% opaque really quickly. Now if I change my flow down, clear down to 12%, and I brush across here, it's coming out much, much slower. So if I kind of build slow, you can see I can sort of get some nice build up just by painting back and forth over some area to build that paint up over and over and over and over, because the flow of the paint is pretty slow. If I crank flow again all the way up, it gets to 100% opaqueness really, really fast. So that's sort of how flow works. Now if I take opacity and I change it down to 25%, but I leave flow at 100%, no matter how many times I pass over this same stroke, it will only ever be 25% opaque. So I can't build up more paint than 25% until I release my mouse and then paint back over again. Now the second stroke can only ever build up to 25%, but where the two overlap, it's essentially 50%. So you can sort of build up this way, but a single stroke, meaning when you press and click before you hold up, it can only ever be the maximum of the opacity setting. And that's sort of how opacity and flow affect one another. Now, just to demonstrate how a tablet here works with a pressure-sensitive tablet, I'm going to activate here. I'll crank these back up to 100%. I'm going to activate this first setting, which means that my pen pressure will affect the opacity of my brush. So even though I'm at 100% opacity, I'm going to press really lightly and draw. And you'll see that I've got a really faint stroke. And as I increase the pressure, meaning I'm pushing harder and harder with my pen on the tablet there, the stroke opacity gets more and more pronounced, or more and more opaque. So I'm going to deselect that, and I'm going to select this second option over here. If you hover over there for a minute, I'll hover my mouse so you can see what this says there. It says always use pressure for size. So in this case, the size of my brush is going to be affected by the pressure, or how hard I push. So if I push really lightly, I have a really, really small size. And as I increase pressure, Again, I'm not changing the brush size here. It's being changed automatically by how hard I press. So if I start really light and I increase pressure, you can see you build up this sizing there. So this is really handy when you're doing some digital painting, because you can sort of press lightly and paint around. You can sort of press a little bit harder to get bigger strokes. And using these opacity and flow settings, you can sort of create some real world simulation of digital painting. So we're going to use a combination of these.